I did it. Okay, you can all see the screen, yeah? Great. Thank you so much for inviting us. I'm not talking about my Hawaiian work today because I understand that you all heard from Thomas Kettig earlier this year, and you probably don't need 2 talks on Hawaiian. So I'm going to be talking about work that's a little bit older, but I'm very excited that Sarah was able to join us because Sarah has done an extension of my original work that is brand new work that just came out at the end of the summer. So we're really excited to be able to tell you about both parts of this work. Okay, so today we're going to be talking to you about creaky voice and the production and perception of creaky voice. And creak it's a non-pathological voice quality. It can also be a pathological voice quality. And Sarah is actually in the communications and disorders department. So if you have questions about the pathology side of it, I think Sarah is probably the right person to ask questions to, but it is also a non-pathological voice quality that's been recognized since the 60s. And some common phonetic properties of creaky voice is both articulatory and acoustic, is that it's a narrowing of the entire laryngeal cavity, a low fundamental frequency, semi-irregular glottal pulses that also have a long closed phase. If you look at the vibrating, how the vocal folds vibrate, they are closed for a longer period of time. And we also see variation in the amplitude of the glottal opening. So it's not going to be a regular amplitude of the openings from cycle to cycle. So these are some of the properties that we are aware of and that people are sensitive to when producing and perceiving creaky voice. So just to give you some examples of what that sounds like from the get-go, I'm going to give you a few different types of sentences here. So these are what we're going to later call partial creak sentences, where the end of the sentence is creaked. And I'll talk more about the prosodic function of creak in that position as we go along. Oops.
I'm glad I waited until I was ready.
So the part in blue on the slides is the part that's creaked, and the part that's in black is modal voice.
I'm glad I waited until I was ready.
And then same here.
Depending on who you're talking to.
So as you can see, we're going to be talking about speaker gender. And so on the top, we have a cisgender female speaker, and on the bottom, we have a cisgender male speaker. And both men and women use creak. Okay, these are sentences that are naturally produced. So all of the data that we're going to be talking today comes from podcasts. So they're not, we didn't elicit this data. These are all naturally produced. And they're mostly from interviews on podcasts. And so here's a sentence where the speaker produced an entire utterance, a grammatically, complete utterance that was entirely creaked.
That is a scary bath.
Oops, sorry. I'm just going to play that again.
That is a scary bath.
And then a male speaker.
I would have been able to save my parents.
Okay, so what are the purposes of, what is the prosodic purpose of creak in American English? Well, it can be used for a lot of different things. One, which has been recognized for a really long time, since the 70s, is that creak is an end of sentence marker. And if you listen to people now, if you've never thought about this before, now that I'm talking to you about it, you will notice it constantly all the time. So when we get to the ends of utterances, and I have a cold today, so I'm just creaking everywhere all the time, but you would notice, especially when I'm giving sort of a lecture like this, that I tend to creak at the ends of my sentences. And so this creak can extend over multiple words. So these examples that I showed you here, they were extending over multiple words. Sometimes it can just be at the end on the last word of the sentence. We can also get creak in American English at the edge of a vowel initial word, particularly at higher prosodic boundaries. So when a word is at the absolute beginning of a phrase, for example, we might get creakiness at the beginning. And another use that has been recognized is that speakers can use it to produce parenthetical phrases. So something like, back in the 80s, you wouldn't believe the hair. I lived in a great neighborhood. Okay, so again, my cold is making me creak everywhere, but you can imagine that you might get creak in that parenthetical phrase in the middle there. Okay, Excuse me. We also know that there are a number of sociolinguistic functions of creaky voice. So it can be used to indicate identities among groups that would like to separate themselves from other groups in the local community. So back in the day, like in the 70s and 80s, when people first started looking at this, mostly in the UK, they noticed that the use of phrase-final creak was really extensive in male upper-class speakers and speakers of received pronunciation. So when we talk about the situation in the United States today, you'll see that this is kind of a funny counterpoint to that, because most people wouldn't think that it's a property of upper-class male speech, but indeed in the 70s and 80s, that's where they were finding it. It has also been associated with Chicano or Chicana gangsters in Northern California and Maori English speakers as compared to European English speakers in New Zealand. So the rates of creak among these groups tend to be a little bit greater than certain counterpoints that they've been compared to. Okay, so now when we start to look at creak in the American English context, if you read the literature, what you find is that both scholars and the public, kind of the lay press, seem to have the opinion that creak is more prevalent for women than it is for men. And if we are just going to rely on some of the most often cited studies, then okay, maybe we see that. So Yuasa is a very prominent study in this area, and she argued that, or in her data, looking at Californian women, they were more likely to produce creak. So she did this by looking at the individual words that they produced and how many of them had creak on them. And she showed that there was about double the amount of creak on words as compared to the men in her sample. And then there's a couple papers, Wolk and Abdelli-Barou, where they argue that vowels in sentences containing creak were 4 times more likely for females than for males among younger speakers. Okay, I'm not going to get into this super much right now, except to say that especially in the mid 2010s, it was just kind of like an obsession in the media with vocal fry, and people, these commentators were talking about how women are, they're sabotaging themselves by using vocal fry in their speech. And so there were a bunch of articles about this that were a little bit frustrating, to say the least. And Sarah will say more about this later as well. Okay, so now if we go back to the linguistic work, one problem with these studies is that judges often, in the studies that I was telling you about, judges often identified the creaky parts using only auditory criteria. So instead of using some kind of spectrographic evidence, typically they listened to files and using their own judgments marked where creak occurred. But when you look at studies that use acoustic criteria, we see that they have more mixed results. So there's a couple studies, Irons and Alexander, and they're actually the men in there, these were speakers in the South, I think, and the men in their speech actually had more creak on more syllables than the women in their speech. And then Abdelli-Barou, who was one of the earlier papers we talked about, she did a follow-up study, and she found that there's actually no difference between male and female American English speakers reading the grandfather passage in her later work. And in that paper, she looked at acoustic criteria for determining when creak was there. Okay, so my question about this was, why do we have the impression that creak is more common for women? There definitely, at least in the mid 2010s, seemed to be this idea that women are the ones who are creaking, and that it was really noticeable among female speakers, and apparently, for many people, not so much among male speakers. And so, I'm a phonetician, so I was wondering, is there some kind of perceptual or acoustic reason for why this impression seemed to be going around? So one possibility is that that we know that the difference between the average male modal F0 and creaky F0 is smaller than for females, right? So if your speaking fundamental frequency is lower and creak is a lower frequency, a lower frequency voice quality as well, then maybe the difference between the male speaking fundamental frequency is just smaller than it is for females. And that makes it more perceptible when you hear it, when you hear the difference between the high speaking fundamental frequency of female speakers as compared to when they go into creak, right? So that would be a bigger difference. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is that listeners are just biased to perceive it only in female speech, right? That in principle, they could identify it in male speech if you force them to, but when just asked who's using it, maybe they're just hearing it only in the female speakers, even if it's present in the male speakers. And then the last possibility is that actually when you ask people to identify it, one possibility is that actually they can identify it equally often between male and female speakers, but only have negative evaluation for female speech. So when I first did this work, I didn't have the evaluation component. And so Sarah is here to tell us now, because they've worked on the evaluation component of the perception of creaky voice. So now we have a better understanding of what's happening there. Okay, so as I've said, low F0 is a particularly salient cue to the perception of creaky phonation. And lots of people who have looked at what listeners are listening to have figured out that like the main thing that people are listening to is like particularly low F0. And lab-based studies of F0 range for creak have reported that it can go as low as 30 hertz. And typically will be between 30 and 80 hertz when you get into the creak portion of some kind of utterance. So that's quite low. So this is what I mean when I say, if you compare that to the typical modal range for male speakers, it's maybe somewhere between 100 and 140 hertz for many male speakers, but 170 to 240 hertz for many male speakers. So the difference between the typical range for males is a lot closer to the typical range for creak than the typical range for female speakers is. And crucially, another thing to add here is that the average F0 that is produced by either male or female speakers of American English doesn't actually differ. So women speakers can also get down into the 30 to 80 hertz range when they're in the creak portion of their utterance. Okay, so we're going to be talking today about two studies that use the same set of stimuli, but did different things. So in the first part, I'm going to be telling you about the identification study, in which I looked at whether listeners are equally likely to identify creaky voice in utterances by male and female speakers, and whether a speaker's speaking fundamental frequency modulates the likelihood of detecting creaky voice, okay? So that's the identification of creak. And then I'm going to hand it over to Sarah, who will be telling us about whether aspects of the listener affect creaky voice evaluation and whether creaky voice is differently evaluated depending on the gender of the speaker. Okay, so let me walk through those hypotheses a little bit more rigorously. So if speaker characteristics modulate the identification of creak, then one possibility is what I've called the acoustic hypothesis. So this is the hypothesis that since male speakers typically have lower modal pitch or lower speaking fundamental frequency, then the comparison with low creaky pitch isn't going to be as salient as it is for female speakers between a higher modal pitch and a lower creaky pitch. Okay, so if you're starting from a lower modal pitch, the difference with creaky pitch is going to be smaller and maybe less salient. The second possibility is what I've called the identification bias hypothesis. So this is the possibility that listeners simply perceive and identify creak in female speech more often than in male speech, regardless of the speaker's modal F0. So even if you have a particularly high or low pitched speaker, it's going to be, speakers might be more biased to hear it in the female speaker, regardless of their speaking fundamental frequency. And that will be manipulated in the study here. And then if it's the case that speaker characteristics don't matter for identification, then we have what I've called the equal opportunity hypothesis, which is actually just that listeners actually may recognize creak in male and female speakers at similar rates. So if you really ask them to say, did you hear creak in this utterance or not, maybe they do it equally among male and female speakers. And so if that's the case, then this would suggest that there's a negative evaluation for creak for female speakers. And that's why we keep seeing people talking about it, like in the press, but also even in academic work. And not just because listeners don't perceive the creak in male speech, but because they only negatively evaluate it for female speakers. Okay, so let me tell you about the first study. So the sound files that I used for the first study and also that will be used in the second study are from natural speech that are taken from high quality podcast recordings. So these are, organizations like NPR or Gimlet or Slate that record in, radio quality conditions. So there's no weird background noise or anything in these files. Where I'm in this part of the study, I'm going to be reporting on 4 speakers who were aged 30 to 42. And I'll be telling you about a high-pitched female speaker. So when I'm talking about this, what I mean is the average modal speaking F0. So if we look at their speaking fundamental frequency over the modal portion of their speech, the average can be compared across these speakers. So we have a high-pitched female speaker, a low-pitched female speaker, a high-pitched male speaker, and a low-pitched male speaker. And crucially, the average modal speaking F0 for the low-pitched female speaker and the high-pitched male speaker are approximately matched. So when we're going to compare eventually the difference between these 2 speakers, right, the difference between their speaking fundamental frequency and their creaky pitch is the same. And what differs is whether they're a male or a female speaker. I will say also that this study that I'm telling you about right now is a follow-up to an initial version that had 4 other speakers. They were slightly less well matched for average modal speaking F0, which is why I redid it with these other 4 speakers. But I'm telling you this because Sarah, in their portion of the talk, will be taking stimuli from all 8 of the speakers that were originally looked at. And but I will say that this work is published, and so if anybody wants to read about the full set of 8 speakers, you can go read that in my Phonetica paper. And the results for both studies were very similar, but I just wanted to be perfectly controlled in this, so I did the second study. Okay, so there were 2 different types of utterances in this study: full sentence versus sentence fragment. All of the utterances are between 1.2 and 2 seconds long. They all had falling declination of pitch. They all had neutral content and no disfluencies or or anything like that. So some examples were they had to start hiring people. He was excited about this visit. It was a full sentence. And then the fragment is something like more than 9,000 years old, depending on who you're talking to. These were mostly ends of phrases. So that's one thing that's going to be manipulated here. The other thing that's going to be manipulated is the amount of creak in the utterances. So we had stimuli that were partially creaky. So here, 40 to 50% of the utterance contained creak, always at the end of the phrase, and usually over at least 2 words, but could have been more. And then the wholly creaky utterances, more than 85% of the utterance was creaky, and the modal part would have always been at the beginning. So there might be 1 word that was, or 1 syllable that was modal, and then the entire rest of the sentence was creaky. And then utterances that were fully modal and had no creak whatsoever. Okay, the experiment was run on mechanical Turk at the time. We're not using that anymore. Now we have other better methods, but at the time, that's what we used. And creaky voice was described to the participants using phrases from the popular press. So they were told the creaky voice is that guttural growl at the back of the throat, gravelly lowering of the voice that conjures the sounds of a door creaking or a hinge that needs oiling, or speaking with a croak, right? So these are all ways that these articles that came out in the mid-2010s described it. And then in a kind of familiarization portion, the participants were presented with 4 labeled examples. So they were told, here's what creak sounds like. And they were given 2 full sentences with partial creak, one spoken by a male and one spoken by a female, that were different than the experimental voices. They had creak at the end. And then 2 instances of fully modal sentences, and they were told which ones had creak and which ones were fully modal. And then in the testing phase, they were presented with 88 stimuli, and all they had to do was listen to the file and answer the question, do you think this phrase contains creaky voice? So they didn't have to identify where it was or anything. They just had to say, do you think this phrase contains creaky voice in it, like anywhere? All right, there were 54 participants, 15 women, 34 men, 6 people did not report their gender. And the IP addresses, the age range was 23 to 61. And the IP addresses were limited to the United States, and they all reported being monolingual. All right, so given the acoustic hypothesis that we talked about earlier, if the identification of creak depends on how high or low the speaker's modal F0 is, then if the low-pitched female speaker and the high-pitched male speakers have a similar modal pitch, then we predict that listeners would be more likely to hear creak on the high-pitched female speakers, followed by equal identification for the low-pitched female and high-pitched male, and then maybe they're least likely to recognize creak when it occurs in the low-pitched male speaker. For the identification bias hypothesis here, we predict that they're just more likely to report creak for female speakers. So it wouldn't matter in this case, what the pitch of the speaker is, whether they're high pitched or low pitched, they're just going to be more likely to hear it on the female speakers than on the male speakers. And then for the equal opportunity hypothesis, this is the prediction that in this kind of task, there's no differences among the speakers, right? So if you just ask them, can you hear creak? If they really can hear it and they can identify that they can hear it, then they should perform the same basically on all of the speakers. Okay, so for the fully modal case, right, the acoustic and bias hypotheses, they mainly pertain to when creak is present, but it would be consistent with the acoustic hypothesis if the listeners associate low F0 with creaky phonation. Then they may false alarm more on the low male speakers, right? So if they just hear lower pitch and they think, oh, that's creaky, then we might get more false alarming on the low male speaker. Or if they're conforming to the bias hypothesis, then they might just generally false alarm more on female speakers, regardless of their fundamental speaking fundamental frequency. As for the amount of creak, prosody could interact with the speaker-based hypotheses. So what I mean by that is it's possible that participants could factor out the creak if when it gets used in the end of utterance environment, right? This is like its linguistic purpose. So maybe it just makes it less salient there because we are, interpreting it as end of sentence and not necessarily as like, oh, it's creak that's marking the end of the sentence. So one possibility is that they're overall going to be less accurate on partial than on whole creak, or there could be a floor effect, so no difference among the speakers. And then the last issue is with the utterance type. So when creak is present, listeners may be more accurate on the fragments because it may be the case that speakers really only expect creaky phonation to co-occur with a full sentence, right? So if you've got a fragment, it's not telling us, the creaky isn't telling us, oh, you're coming to the end of a sentence because it isn't a full sentence. So here, one hypothesis is that creak is going to be more salient when it's present in a fragment than when it's present in the full sentence. Okay, so there's a lot of hypotheses because there were a lot of manipulations, but let's get to the results. So the first thing we looked at was performance on the whole creak stimuli, right? So these were the entire utterances were creaked. We have the aqua-colored bar is the fragment and the purple bar is the sentence. And here, there's just no significant differences at all, right? And then, sorry, I should point out on the x-axis at the bottom, it's each of the speakers, right? The high female, the low female, the high male, and the low male. And so for the whole creak situation, there were just no significant differences. They were really good at hearing that those utterances were creaked, like 80% or higher. For partial creak, there actually were no significant differences among the speakers if we collapse over fragment and sentence. I know that the high female speaker has a big difference, but actually there was nothing significant came out of that. But there was overall lower accuracy on sentences for female speakers, but not for male speakers. So if you just look at the difference between the aqua bars for the first two there, which are the female speakers, there was a bigger difference there. So listeners were less likely to recognize creak when it was present on the sentences than on the fragments for the female speakers. And then if we compare across the entire category for whole versus partial, what we found is that there's lower accuracy for partial creak than for whole creak, just collapsing over everything. And the modal case is interesting because what we see here is that the listeners were significantly more accurate on the high-pitched female speaker and significantly less accurate on the low-pitched male speaker. So when it came to modal, they were pretty good at saying when the high-pitched female speaker was completely modal, and they were false alarming a lot on when the low-pitched male speaker was producing completely modal results. Okay, so in sum, for partial creak, we get lower accuracy across the general condition as compared to whole creak, right? So they're just not as likely to recognize it in the partial creak case. We also get lower accuracy on sentences in the partial creak condition for some of the speakers, for the female speakers in particular. And we get the lowest accuracy of all on the low male speaker in the modal condition, which means that speakers are false alarming and identifying creak for that speaker when it's not there. Again, we get this higher accuracy on whole creak compared to partial creak, which I think is kind of interesting because what it suggests is that listeners are factoring out creak when it's serving its prosodic function as an end of utterance marker. Right. So it's being used there in a way that all listeners and all talkers use it in American English. And so it may just be harder to recognize that there's creak there because what instead you're hearing is, oh, that speaker's coming to the end of a phrase. And related to that, I guess, in some ways, is that they were less accurate on the sentences than on the phrases, right? So if the expectation of utterance-final creak is strongest for a complete sentence, as opposed to a fragment, then we're going to see lower accuracy there. And that is what we saw, at least for some of the speakers. Okay. So listeners are more likely to false alarm on the low male speaker because the modal range overlaps with typical creak values. So for this particular speaker, his average modal F0 was actually 90 hertz, is very low. And this is consistent with an acoustically based influence on recognizing creak. But there really isn't actually, other than that, strong evidence for either the acoustic or the identification bias hypothesis, right? In either one of these cases, we would have expected an explanation for a perception that creaky voice. Sorry, it would have helped to explain why there seems to be a perception of creaky voice for female speech as opposed to male speech. But we actually get little evidence of that. Like, speakers are kind of fine in this study at identifying it in male speakers when it's there. So in the whole creak condition, for example, and then for the most part in the partial creak condition, they're just kind of similar in the male and female speakers. So this is maybe more consistent with the equal opportunity hypothesis. So other than the false alarming on the low male speaker because his speaking fundamental frequency is literally in the creak range, otherwise they don't seem to be making much difference between the male and the female speakers. So this leaves open the possibility that creak is recognized equally in both male and female speakers, but only negatively evaluated for female speakers. And this is the point at which I'm going to turn it over to Sarah, who will tell you a little bit more about what we know about evaluation. Okay, Sarah. So Sarah, tell me when you want me to advance. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah. Awesome. So as Lisa talked about, mentioned a few times, there's been a lot of press in media about negative evaluations of women when they use creaky voice or vocal fry. And this maybe fueled some studies that have been done in the academic realm on this. So there's been a fair amount of work examining listener evaluations of women's speech when creaky voice is used. In these studies, listeners are asked to rate speakers on a variety of constructs, with stimuli primarily differing on the presence or absence of creaky voice. Advance, please. Thank you. So young women in particular have been found to sound less hireable, less trustworthy, less educated, less intelligent, less natural sounding, and less pleasant sounding when their speech contains creaky voice. A number of methodological issues, including presence of creak in modal stimuli, has prompted us to revisit this idea and this body of work. So if you could advance, in our first iteration of this work, which is prior to the study that I'll be talking about today, in our first iteration, we did a modified replication of this body of work. And we found that stimuli that did not or did contain creaky voice just on the last syllable, so in that phrase final expected position, it did not, listeners did not differently evaluate those two types of stimuli, particularly on hireability and pleasantness scales is what we looked at. So that was an interesting finding, and so we wanted to follow up on that with new stimuli, which is what I'll be talking about next. Advance, please. So first, we wanted to know what would happen when there was more creak over the utterance instead of just on the last syllable. Second, we wanted to ask if there were differences in listener evaluations between male and female speakers. And third, we wanted to know if there were differences between listener groups. So now going to those sub-bullets, our hypotheses were first that since creak spans more of the utterance than just that expected phrase final position, it would be more perceptually salient and therefore more negatively evaluated. Our second hypothesis was that given the amount of focus on creak use in women's speech, that women speakers would be more negatively evaluated than men. And third, we had some evidence in that initial study that indicated some listeners evaluated stimuli with creak differently than others. We predicted that this would again hold true for this study. Advance, please. So we recruited listeners through Prolific. In the previous iteration of this project, we had examined listener groups of different gender and age groups, and we found some differences in the older aged group. So we contained our listeners to that group for this follow-up study, so ages 50 to 60. And we looked at two gender groups. This reason for this was the availability of these two gender groups on the platform on Prolific. And then finally, we looked at two racial groups. So the motivation for examining these listener groups is twofold. First, a stereotyped user of creaky voice is a Valley girl, at least in the US context. So this Valley girl stereotype is often thought of as white. And second, much of the work on listener evaluations focuses on hireability. The attributes that I had listed earlier, the first one was looking at hireability, so many studies have looked at hireability. This has been a huge focus in this body of work. And when we think about hireability and professionalism, particularly, we know that these have been discussed in those more sociology realm as being white constructs. So this prompted us to ask this question if there might be differences in listener groups when we look at racial identities. Advance. So the stimuli for this experiment were the same as the ones that Lisa just discussed, plus the previous set of speakers. So this is like the full 8 speakers. We had 8 whole utterance sentences from each of 8 speakers, with both male and female speakers. And for each speaker, half of the sentences contained whole utterance creak and half did not. We looked at the accuracy ratings that Lisa collected from her study, and the stimuli that we selected for this follow-up had a mean identification accuracy of 84%, so well above chance. Advance. Our experiment was run on Gorilla, which is an online experiment builder. We had participants rate stimuli on 2 scales. First, they were asked to rate voices on how pleasant they sounded, and then second, on how hireable they sounded for a professional corporate job. The rating scales were on this visual analog scale. The tick mark was always in the middle, and they could not move that tick mark until the full audio file had played. These were encoded numerically on our end, but participants didn't see that number when they were moving the slider. Advance, please. Okay, so what did we find? First, let's orient ourselves on the y-axis. For both of these plots, we have ratings for pleasantness on the left and hireability on the right. Less pleasant and less hireable is at the bottom, more pleasant and more hireable is at the top. And the x-axis shows the distribution of responses. So these are like histograms on their sides. Blue is ratings for stimuli with creak, and red is for ratings with no creak. And this is averaged ratings for all stimuli for each listener. The diamonds are the median ratings, which, as you can see, are fairly spaced apart, so definitely not overlapping. In regards to our first research question, if creak is negatively evaluated when it's over more of the phrase than just the last syllable, we found yes, it is. These were significant differences, and this was a very strong finding from this study. This is a big point of contrast from our initial study that only had creak on the last syllable, where we found no overall differences for stimuli with and without creak. That was not something that came out for that study, and that was something that very much did come out for this study. And what I want to point out too is that this is for all speaker genders. So this is not showing any difference between the male and female speakers. This is just all stimuli with and without creak. But we were interested in looking at listener groups too. So let's move on to looking at those. We did find a few interactions with listener groups for how listeners rated stimuli with and without creak. On the y-axis here, we have pleasantness ratings, less on the bottom, more at the top. The x-axis shows listener race, black and white. And we found here, if you could advance, that white listeners had a greater difference in how they rated sentences with and without creak, particularly rating sentences with creak as sounding less pleasant. Advance. So looking at listener gender for hireability ratings, we see a similar story for female listeners compared to male. If you could advance, we'll show that highlighted, where we had female listeners with a greater difference in rating stimuli on hireability for these different voice qualities than did male listeners. Advance. And a third finding regarding listener groups, when we looked at race and gender together, we saw that Black male listeners rated all stimuli as sounding more pleasant overall than any other listener group. Advance. Okay, so we found that the amount of creak present in stimuli does make a difference when talking about listener evaluations. Whereas in our initial study of this evaluation work, where we had only creak on the last syllable of a sentence and no overall differences were found for sentences with and without creak, here we saw differences in listener evaluations between stimuli with creak spanning more of the utterance. This was a strong finding from this study, and the reason for this difference in the effect of the amount of creaky voice could be due to the higher salience of creak. This is something that Lisa was talking about before. So this is just by virtue of it being of there being more of it in the stimuli. Another reason could be that creak spanning an entire utterance in isolation without the context, thanks Lisa, without the context of the larger narrative could be more unexpected for the listener compared to creak just on the last syllable of a single utterance. Okay, I'm ready for the next bullet. Thank you. In terms of the gender aspect of this work, we did not find an effect of speaker gender at all, nor as an interaction with listener gender. So this is contrary to what we might have expected, given the amount of focus on young women's use of creaky voice. Sentences with creaky voice were rated as sounding less hireable and less pleasant, no matter if the speaker was female or male. This aligns with the study that Lisa just discussed, where neither the acoustic nor the identification bias hypotheses bore out in identifying creak across male and female speakers. Okay, next bullet. So in terms of listener groups, we found that white listeners and female listeners rated stimuli with and without creak more differently than other groups for pleasantness and hireability, respectively. So while these differences came out as significant from our model, we note that these differences are fairly small. And for these two findings about differences between listeners, these differences were in the distance of ratings. They weren't a whole shift down for all stimuli, nor was it a drastic shift down for just the stimuli with creaky voice. So our hypothesis that there would be differences across racial groups, given the whiteness of the Valley Girl stereotype and the construction of professionalism, was not a robust finding from this study, given that the difference across the rating difference for across these listener groups was small and was only for pleasantness and not hireability. Regarding the finding across listener gender groups, we again note that while the difference was significant, it was small and only pertained to hireability. So further, and most importantly, the difference across listener gender groups is not an interaction with speaker gender. Our hypothesis that listeners would rate stimuli from female speakers more negatively than stimuli from male speakers was not found here. And lastly, we saw that Black male listeners rated sentences overall as sounding more pleasant than other groups. This is not a finding that we anticipated nor have a good explanation for. So first, this difference, while significant, was small. And secondly, our best interpretation of this finding was simply a difference in use of the scale. So I want to give a caveat for the differences across listener groups here, that they should not be interpreted very strongly, given that the differences were small. But I do believe that the overall picture that listeners evaluate voices differently is an important takeaway. Next slide. Okay, so the negative evaluation of creaky voice does seem to depend on how much creak there is in the stimuli. But we didn't find differences across speaker genders, at least for male and female speakers. This aligns with Lisa's findings that there was very little difference in identifying creak between male and female speakers. And lastly, we saw that while differences across listener groups were small, we saw that listeners evaluate creaky voice and voices more generally differently from one another. And this contrasts with a lot of the work that's been done on the evaluation of creak in women's voices, which often discuss these evaluations as being universal. And have very rarely looked at listener groups within their participant pool. So that's all I had.
All right, I think we're